All right, whenever you're ready, Liam.
Are you okay there, Finola? If it's okay with you, I'll just give you a quick intro just while you're getting your materials together there. So just happy St. Bridget's Day to everybody, and you're all very welcome to Trasnet here this evening. As you'll have noticed, the functionality is slightly different. So we've upgraded our Zoom to webinar, and I'm still certainly getting used to the controls, so do bear with us this evening. Can you hear me, Finola?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Am I coming over okay?
Great. So Fionnuala is back with us this evening to do this lecture entitled Saints and Supers. Which, although we're covering Reverend Picate in many other parts of Ireland. So if you want to put any questions into the Q&A box, I will ask Fionnuala at the end. So over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Liam. Thank you for the welcome, and thank you, everybody.
Fionnuala, hopefully everything's okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining this evening, and I really appreciate it. I know that, on the other hand, I can't really say I know you have lots to do because of the times that are in it, but I still really appreciate you joining us this evening. Now, my topic today revolves around this tiny little church in West Cork. It's called Altar Church. It's called Teampall na Mucht, the Church of the Poor. And it's a very unassuming little church, very pretty, but it in its day was the center of an absolute firestorm of accusation and counter accusations. And the reason it fascinates me so much is that I believe it has much to teach us about sectarian strife and how the best and the worst can come out in people under extreme circumstances. The main protagonist at the heart of this story is the Reverend William Allen Fisher. Born in 1801, died in 1880. Died, by the way, of famine fever, not during the famine, but during a subsequent famine in the 1880s. Due to his actions during the famine, he is regarded by some as a saint and by others as the worst example of a cleric who tried to buy souls for soup. Now, I should explain the term super. Originally, it was applied to those who gave the soup. Latterly, it's often been applied to those who took the soup. And it's probably the worst insult that you can call an Irish person. Where are we talking about? Well, the center of our drama is the Mizen Peninsula, which is the bottom circle. But I'm also going to be mentioning Achill Island, the top circle, and Dingle on the middle circle. And that's because all of these places were centers for Protestant proselytizing activity. The close-up of the Mizen Peninsula, it's the most southwesterly peninsula in Ireland. In the 19th century, it was extremely remote and difficult of access, and it was quite poor. Let's go on and take a look at the conditions between 1800 and 1845, and we'll start with the conditions for Catholic. And I'll start with this somewhat odd choice. This is a Bronze Age wedge tomb, and it's known as the altar wedge tomb. Prehistoric, and for me, it represents something, and I'll come to that in a second. But when I'm talking about Catholicism, I realized some time ago that most of what I thought I knew about Catholicism in this period was wrong, because I had been completely over-influenced by my own upbringing and experience. Ireland in the 50s and 60s. And at that time, Ireland was a country in which each town or village was dominated by a large Catholic church. And the priest was a man of great influence. The population, which was 90% Catholic, went to Mass every Sunday, and we all participated in sodalities and novenas and retreats regularly. And the children all attended school where Catholic doctrine was integrated into the curriculum. Now, this paints a picture in the mid-century, mid-20th century, of a devout, disciplined, orderly, monocultural society. And none of that was true in the first half of the 19th century. And how does this Bronze Age wedge tomb symbolize that? Well, and that's because it was in use as a mass rock. It was, and that was, many of our prehistoric monuments got repurposed as mass rocks, where people would meet to say mass in secret. And this, of course, was due to the penal laws. And this particular wedge tomb / mass rock is right across the road from the Champelnamuk, the church that we're talking about. So what were the penal laws? And I want to fill you in on a lot of background here and not assume that you have a lot of knowledge about this period. I certainly didn't when I started researching it. So apologies to those who are experts. I feel that it's necessary to go into a lot of this detail. So the penal laws, the intent was to penalize the practice of Catholicism. It was a series of laws that started after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 and were in effect until the end of the 1700s, really, with the last remaining major one ending with the enactment of Catholic emancipation in 1829. They were basically divided into 4 or 5 main categories: laws against religion, education, property, and social activities. So Catholic bishops were banned completely. Parish priests had to be registered and take special oath. Catholics were forbidden to have schools of their own or to have their children educated by Catholic teachers. No Catholic could own a horse worth more than £5. They were forbidden to buy land. They couldn't lease property for more than 31 years. They couldn't become a guardian. They couldn't carry arms. The laws of inheritance were altered so that a son or daughter who adopted the Protestant religion would become the sole heir or heiress to the property. Now, these were extremely draconian measures, and the net result of them was an apartheid that reduced the Catholic Irish to illiteracy and poverty and forced them to practice their religion in secret. At the end of this period, which also coincided with further plantations in which the land was confiscated from the Irish and handed over to planters who were almost entirely British and Protestant, only 5% of the land remained in Catholic hands. So all the land in the Mizzen was owned by a landlord class who were almost 100% Protestant or Church of Ireland, while the vast majority of the people were Indigenous Irish and Catholic. Now, this is the area we're talking about. This is Toormore Bay. As you can see, it's incredibly beautiful, but it's also very rocky and barren. Very little arable land here. I think that we could say that poverty was the defining characteristic of the vast majority of Catholics in the Mizzen. This is a good example, although it's from Galway, this is a good example of what was called 4th class housing. And this is the kind of housing that most people in the Mizzen, a huge majority of the population, lived in, this 4th class land. You can see that the man is actually dressed and appears to be wearing shoes. Most people wore nothing but rags, and shoes were a distant luxury. The economy was based on potatoes, so the economy of the poor. Each cabin depended on what they could grow on an acre or even half an acre. The type of potato that was grown was called the lumper. It was very nutritious and it could feed whole families. And so after the advent of the potato and the setting up of the potato-based economy, the population burgeoned, and by the time of the famine had reached 8 million. But as you all know, any monoculture crop is very dangerous because if anything happens to it, there's no backup. Now, of course, also there was no security of tenure. Tenants were routinely evicted for non-payment of rent or at the landlord's will. few were ever compensated, and there's certainly evidence of wholesale land clearance after the famine, but it certainly happened a lot before the famine as well. Now, despite all of this, in and around Catholic emancipation 1829, and often with the help of what were called liberal Protestant landlords, there were some proper churches built on the Mizzen to replace the former mass houses, which for the most part were just falling down shacks. And here's a view of Ballydehob in the early, we know it's in the early 1820s because the church is already built in the hill, and that was built even before, it was built in 1825, just before Catholic emancipation. And believe it or not, that same church is still in use today. However, most people to worship in, and so masses for the most part were conducted outdoors. This is a photograph taken of an outdoor mass much later, but it'll show, and people are actually well dressed in this photo, but it kind of shows the kind of thing. Even if there was a church, mass attendance was really low because people didn't have enough clothes to go to mass in, or they couldn't afford the price of admission. And in those days, you had to pay a penny or maybe a farthing to get into the church. And so sometimes they turned up and stayed outside, or sometimes they just stayed away altogether. And in addition to that, there were actually very few priests anyway. During the penal laws, all of them had to be educated on the continent. Maynooth was established at the beginning of the 19th century. It took a long time for them to turn out enough priests to cover the vast population. And also, so there was a real shortage of priests, and also there were practically no resources in Irish, the language of the vast majority of the population. So how did this enormous impoverished population stay connected to their idea of themselves as Catholics? And how did they participate in religious observances? Well, the answer appears to be to lie in a host of practices that centered on feast days like St. Patrick's Day or May Eve or Halloween or Lunasa. And in patterns, the complex customs that accompanied a visit to a shrine or to a holy well. There were also highly ritualized wakes and funerals, and a whole other vast set of sort of semi-religious, semi-folk beliefs, often based in pre-Christian traditions, that influenced the daily actions of people. Now, pattern days like this one grew in popularity and were often the occasion of enormous gatherings. Pilgrims would come to perform the truss, the pilgrimage, which was a ritualized set of rounds and prayers. The first half of the day was taken up with this kind of activity. The second half of the day was for feasting and drinking, and often a faction fight would emerge. Now, a faction fight in itself was a ritualized contest between members of different families. And the day would end, very often there's lots and lots of descriptions of the sort of the parties and the goings on that would happen after the ritual of the prayers at the Holy Well or a shrine of some kind. Now, all of these practices, of course, were deplored by the Church of Ireland. Their ministers, their members were horrified by the sort of the semi-pagan and idolatrous, what they considered to be idolatrous nature of these activities, and by the violence that often marked the end of the day. When Protestant missionaries were looking for support for evangelizing missions, all they really had to do was to describe one of these pattern days to a polite and educated British audience, and the money came pouring in to save these poor benighted souls. Now, education, of course, was another huge issue, and the Irish had hedge schools where they were taught by itinerant masters. But eventually, and this is an early national school that is now derelict. The National Schools Act was passed in 1831, and this act was specifically and emphatically non-denominational. Before this, there were several Protestant societies forming, supporting rudimentary schools in the mission, on the Mizzen, schools in which the Bible was used as a teaching text. Catholics could attend those, and many did, in order to get a rudimentary education, or they went to the hedge schools, or they had no education at all. Now, when the National Schools Act was passed in 1831, Catholics seized upon the opportunity to build national schools, and the efforts were often headed up by the parish priest, who carved out areas adjacent to, but separate from, their churches to build a new school. And this one, the now derelict one, was built right beside a Catholic church, but separate from it. All the religious instruction, any religious instruction to take place in these schools must happen on Saturdays or after school hours. Now, Catholics, as I said, embraced the whole opportunity to start building schools, but Protestants were outraged that the Bible was banned as a teaching text, and did not participate and set up their own schools, financed mainly by missionary societies. And I think this is one of the great tragedies of Irish history, that a national school system that was set up to be specifically non-denominational didn't turn out that way at all. In fact, we have a highly segregated school system here. And in my small village, the village of Ballydehob, there is both a Catholic and a Protestant elementary school. So let's talk now a little bit about the Protestants and their position. And it's very important to understand, I think, mainstream Protestantism during this era. So the Puritan period of the 1700s had given way to an era of more broad church, emphasizing latitudinarianism, which was a tolerant sort of live and let live era. However, by the 1820s, this had been replaced again by a more fundamentalist and evangelical form of Anglicanism. Much like we imagine the Southern Baptist style of church in America today, emphasizing biblical literalism, providentialism, and that meant that anything bad that happened was by the will of God, and it was often a punishment for transgression, and a sort of Calvinistic belief that prosperity was associated with goodness and poverty with sinfulness. Now, I really can't overemphasize how normal this kind of attitude was in the day. That kind of fundamentalist evangelical Protestantism was very much the norm in the Church of England and the Church of Ireland. And it was combined with the horror, as I said, of what was seen as the idolatrous and primitive practices of Catholicism. And anti-Catholic sentiment was rife in this period. Now, I'm using the term Protestant throughout, but I do want to clarify that there were several forms of Protestantism besides the established Church of Ireland. John Wesley, and here he is preaching. He had come on preaching tours several times and had left a thriving Methodist tradition in Ireland, which persists to this day. And besides Catholics, non-Church of Ireland forms of Protestantism were also the targets of discrimination and had been subject to penal laws. The 16th century, this is a map of the diocese of the Church of Ireland. The 16th century Act of Supremacy created the Church of Ireland, Church of England, with the monarch as its head, and it then became the government-sanctioned or established church. And that is the only one that is recognized as having authority and that is state-supported. And by extension, the established church in Ireland was called the Church of Ireland. And I know sometimes this is a bit confusing for people from outside Ireland, because knowing that it's a heavily Catholic country, they make an initial assumption that the Church of Ireland means Catholic Church, but in fact, it means the Protestant Church. Now, As the established government-sponsored church, all church property also accrued to the Church of Ireland. This is St. Patrick's Cathedral, built by the Normans initially, and it and all the other in existence churches, friaries, monasteries, everything now became the property of the Church of Ireland. And one of the things about being the established church is that your position is maintained through tithing. And everyone, no matter their own religion, had to pay tithes to maintain the established church. And this was enforced sometimes brutally and with the backing of the state. So in this picture, for example, you can see the proctor with his hand out and the military at the door ready to back him out. Now, this, of course, as you can imagine, was absolutely the cause of outrage among Catholics and non-Church of Ireland Protestants as well. And tithe wars raged throughout the 1820s and the 1830s. This is an image of Daniel O'Connell at one of his monster meetings, which he held all over the country, including in Skibbereen and Bantry in West Cork. Now, eventually, Catholic emancipation was won in 1829, and a compromise on tithes was reached in the 1830s, which commuted them somewhat, but mainly sort of sent them underground. They moved the burden onto the landlords, who, of course, passed them on to the tenants. So the tenants weren't much better off, but the whole thing sort of settled down a bit because at least it was more hidden. Here's a man, this is the Reverend Robert Trail. And in West Cork, these tithe protests were most hotly condemned by this man, Reverend Robert Trail. He was the rector of Schull. He was virulently anti-Catholic, but remember, that wasn't unusual. And of course, he was afraid of losing his income. His father had employed a very brutal proctor, and this had not been forgotten in the district. But I don't want you to cast him as the villain in this story just yet, because just remember him and we'll come back to him later. Now, sometimes anti-tithe protests led to violence, and there were several incidents in West Cork where rectors or vicars were attacked. This is an incident at Carrickshock where there was a whole-scale battle. It was a dangerous time in some ways to be a Protestant minister in Ireland. And as you can imagine, it was an uncomfortable position to be in. 90% of the, or 85% or so of the population was Catholic, who deeply resented you being there and having to support you. I want to also mention this man. This is Archbishop James Ussher, and he's long before our story happens. He was the Protestant Primate of Ireland in 1634, but I do have a reason for mentioning him. Now, James Ussher was the one who calculated that the world was created on the 23rd of October 4004 BC. And he was at the time very influential, and this was broadly accepted right up into the 20th century, early 20th century. There are still people who believe that. However, for our story here, what's more important is his other claim, which was equally influential, and that is that the Church of Ireland, not the Catholic Church, was the true successor to the original Irish Christian faith brought by St. Patrick. St. Patrick, he claimed, was Protestant in his orientation. And that's still the position of, and he was Protestant, and what really interfered was Rome. So the Protestant religion was a much more faithful reflection of the ancient Christianity that St. Patrick had brought. And this, by the way, is still the position of the Church of Ireland to this very day, very much contested by the Catholic Church, of course. And I can't really go into the arguments here, but I want you to remember that claim, because we'll come back to it later, that the Protestants, not the Catholics, are the true inheritors of Patrick's Christianity. Now, here's another bishop. This is William Magee, the Archbishop of Dublin, and he was fervently committed to the Second Reformation. What do I mean by that? Well, he gave a firebrand sermon when he was inaugurated in 1822. And this was generally seen as the kickoff of what was called the Protestant Crusade in Ireland. And his belief was that the conversion of what he called Romanists to Protestantism, he saw that as a far better option for them and for the country. And his sermon effectively marked the end of any leftover latitudinarian attitudes in Ireland and heralded the arrival of a new era for the Church of Ireland, in which educational, evangelical, and proselytizing activities were seen as absolutely essential. And so it began. The evangelists saw a fertile field in Ireland and set out armed with their Bibles and their pamphlets and their tracts, ready to convert anyone they can, ready with zeal. Why go to Africa, they thought, when there was this ripe field for conversion right next door in Ireland. Now, I want to quote from two authorities on this period. One is Irene Whelan, and here's the quote. She said, "The vast institutional and ideological machinery that lay behind the drive to make Ireland a Protestant country included not only a massive system of private philanthropy, but more importantly, a fully developed political doctrine rooted in the belief that the source of Ireland's social and political problems was the Catholic religion, and that the country would never be prosperous and developed until Catholicism and all its influences were eradicated." I find that very interesting statement because it's talking about the early part of the 19th century, but I think there are probably lots of people in Ireland who still feel that way. Desmond Bowen is the recognized authority on this Protestant crusade. And he says, and this is my quote from him, "Although their first desire was the purely religious one of freeing Catholics from the bondage of their sin by bringing them the blessings of biblical Christianity, they," meaning the evangelists, "they soon found it advantageous to combine their religious crusading with English cultural imperialism. How could the Irish peasantry read the Bible unless they attended schools? And how could they attend evangelical schools and not be culturally influenced by the alien but superior way of life they found there? Proselytizing sought to bring them the twofold blessing of a reformed faith and British civilization." Now, the most sort of visible or maybe extreme form of this effort at proselytizing was the establishment of colonies, Protestant colonies. And this is the one in Achill, very well known and well worth a talk on its own. Liam, you might want to take note of that. And this is Edmund Nangle, the administrator of this colony. It was sort of like a model village, showing the benefits of a sober, hardworking Protestant way of life. And it was very controversial from the start. Another one was established in Dingle by Charles Gayer, and this is actually his sketch of the mission. And it shows the mission boat going to the Blaskets. And herein lies sort of one of the interesting conundrums of this evangelical movement, because part of it involved translating the Bible into Irish and the provision of literature in Irish, and the emphasis on education and literacy in order to be able to read the Bible and the tracts. Now, there are scholars, in fact, who insist that the wonderful flowering of Irish writing on the Blaskets owed much to the Bible texts and stories brought by these missionaries. And if you can make it out, at the very bottom it says, "The missionary boat Crusader for the Blasket Islands." Now, many, many missionary societies were founded to support the work of evangelizing the Irish, and several of them focused on education, on building and provisional schools, including this one, very charmingly named the Association for Discountenancing Vice and Promoting the Practice of Religion and Virtue. And here is one of their schools. It's now a private residence. It's in Durras, and the right-hand part of the building was originally the school founded and supported with the support of this discountenancing vice organization. But there were many, many, many such schools, and they were all over the place, and there were certainly many of them around the Mizen Peninsula. Now, let's move on to talk about the actual famine, the famine itself. And I just want to say a quick word about vocabulary here. Again, there are many who object to the word famine, and they prefer the term Great Hunger, a term I appreciate very much. I'm using the word famine because it's the word used in much of the literature of the time and subsequently, but also because some people feel the term should only be used when there's a complete failure of the food system, an absence of food. And that is the case on the Mizen during this time. We can genuinely refer to the Mizen as a place that suffered from famine. Now, this is Lillian Lucy Davidson's deeply moving painting. The potato crop first failed in 1845. Although there was suffering in the winter of 1845-46, most people did manage to get through that winter. However, the crop failed again in the summer of 1846, and then that winter, 46 to 47, spelled the beginning of widespread distress. People did starve to death, but most died of famine fever, various kinds of famine fevers, and cholera and diphtheria, and illnesses brought on by lack of nutrition and by unsanitary conditions. And the Mizen, in which the vast majority of people were already living on the knife edge of existence, was very badly affected. Now, the only resort really that people had were to these relief committees, which were made up by local clergymen and gentlemen. And many relief committees did wonderful work. They set up soup kitchens, they petitioned for board of work schemes, and generally speaking, things would have been a lot worse without them. And I'm just using this picture to represent what the Kilmoo Relief Committee might have been like. And Kilmoo was the parish that encompassed Goleen and Schull, Goleen and Toormore. And what I want to do is read you out in full the proposed motion of the Kilmoo Relief Committee, and also the names of the people who proposed these motions. So proposed by the Reverend Fisher and seconded by, he was the rector of the Protestant Church, and seconded by the Reverend Lawrence O'Sullivan, Catholic parish priest. That this committee, having repeatedly tried, before I go on, I want to read this out in full to you, because I think it has the immediacy of men who are normally very law-abiding at their wits' end, and also because it is a document that is directly from the period and the place that we're talking about. That this committee, having repeatedly tried, but in vain, to arouse the attention of the government to the state of destitution and distress in this remote district, have determined to bring the matter before the public through the medium of the press. Proposed by Richard Hungerford, second by the Reverend Henry P. Proctor, that the following statement of facts be forwarded. The parish of Kilmoo contains 7,234 inhabitants, or 1,289 families. We calculate that 7,000 inhabitants require food in consequence of the failure of the potato crop. The parish produces very little corn. Potatoes feed the people, the pigs, the poultry, the cows, the horses, and enable the fisherman to dispose of his fish, for which he did not this year get as much as paid the expenses of taking and saving it, as the poor from the destruction of the potato crop are unable to purchase it. Thus deprived of their only means of support, they are now literally famishing. All this in substance we have stated over and over again to the Lord Lieutenant, the Lieutenant of the County, the Commissary General, and the Commissary at Skibbereen. We asked a depot, we offered a store free of expense, we entered security, and when we had done all this, at the end of a month, we received a letter from the castle with a paper on brown bread enclosed to say we had better purchase wheaten and barley meal. Proposed by the Reverend Thomas Barrett, Roman Catholic curate, and seconded by Mr. John Coughlin. That this committee feel quite unable to meet the views of the government. There are only 2 resident gentry in this district. There are no merchants here. There are no mills within 23 miles. There's no bakery within that distance, nor is there any way of procuring food except through the medium of our committee, which out of our limited funds of £165 have kept up a small supply of Indian meal, and even with our very best exertions, in consequence of our trifling finances and being obliged to bring our supplies from Cork by water, we have been twice for a fortnight altogether without meal. Proposed by Mr. B. Townsend, seconded by Mr. J. Fleming, that our funds are now exhausted and we've no means of renewing them, while the demand for food is fearfully increasing. We see no other way left to us but try to the medium of the press to arouse the government to a sense of the fearful state of things which is inevitably impending. Rapine has already commenced, and who can wonder? Many are living solely on salted herring, many more on seaweed, and when our last supply of Indian meal was sold, they offered 3 shillings a stone and would not go away without it for some that was damaged, the very smell from which was so offensive that it was thought unfit and dangerous food for human beings. Proposed by Reverend Lawrence O'Sullivan, parish priest, and seconded by Mr. A. Sullivan, that these resolutions be published in all the Cork newspapers, the Dublin Evening Post, Dublin Evening Mail, and the Times London newspaper, and a copy be sent to Lord John Russell and Sir Randolph Ruth, with a faint hope that something may be done without delay, for the case is urgent, to relieve our misery and want, else the public will soon hear of such tales of woe and wickedness as will harrow the feelings and depress the spirits of the most stout-hearted men. Signed, Richard Notter, Chairman, W.A. Fisher, Rector of Kilmoe. Now, what this shows is that everyone was working together at this point. The famine continued, it got worse. This is a picture, by the way, by Daniel MacDonald, the same one who painted the faction fighter and the eviction painting. But at least everyone was pulling together. Everybody, all the Protestant, the Catholic, the landlord, the clergy, they were all cooperating to run this relief committee, and all feeling equally desperate and in need of relief. The relief didn't come. Things got more and more desperate. Deaths increased. The illustrator, James O'Mahony, the Cork artist, was sent by the Illustrated London News, and his pictures of what was happening are very famous. And this particular picture is Robert Trail. Remember him? The one who was so virulently anti-Catholic and very distressed by the tithe wars. And it shows him visiting a poor Catholic family, Mullen's Hut. The interesting thing is that before the famine started and before he met Reverend Trench, who came to do good in the area, he had never been inside a Catholic home. However, he saw what needed to be done, and he was the rector of Schull, and he worked tirelessly to try and feed as many people as he could without regard for their religion. And he died of famine fever himself in 1847, and he was mourned and honored by everybody for his heroic efforts. And now we'll come to the specifics of what happened in Toormore, and back to the Reverend William Fisher. Fisher was a Trinity-educated scholar, and he was fluent in Irish. He appears to have been a very charismatic man, sort of gentle. He was described as patrician in his manner, kind. He was loved by his flock, whether they were Protestant born or converts. He was also a bit of a curious mixture. He was very evangelical and anti-Catholic, very much in that way a man of his time. But he was also influenced by the High Church Tractarian movement. John Henry Newman and others wrote highly influential tracts aimed at moving the Anglican Church back towards Catholicism, with such things as confession and communion being reintroduced, and the emphasis taken off the pulpit and onto the altar. And you can see all these kind of almost contradictory parts of his personality in what's coming up. His son-in-law was Standish O'Grady. Standish O'Grady was a famous character of the Celtic Revival, and you can see there. I hope you can see there this quote from Standish O'Grady, and obviously he was full of admiration for this man, for Fisher. Fisher had succeeded Standish O'Grady's father, the Reverend O'Grady, as rector of Kilmoo, and after which O'Grady, the clergyman, moved on to Castletownbere. But before he went, he'd already won many converts before the famine, and the Protestant population in Kilmoo was increasing greatly. Here is one of the quotes in which I think you can say that Fisher is seen as a saint. Fisher was initially involved in establishing a soup kitchen in Goleen. However, it all began to fall apart very quickly. And here's a quote from Father Lawrence O'Sullivan. I'll just give you a minute to read that. I'm sorry, the quote is by a man called Mr. Bishop to Sir Randolph Ruth, who's the commissary. Now, the clergyman, the clergyman that he's referring to as Fisher, of course, and also Father Lawrence O'Sullivan. And it's whether or not Father Lawrence O'Sullivan deserted his flock at this time is very controversial. It's been asserted by Bowen. He says that the people had quarreled with Father O'Sullivan and he had left. But the real authority on this, on all of this, Father Paddy Hickey, who's written the book Famine in West Cork, he asserts that yes, he left, but only for a very limited time to raise funds. And while he was away for that purpose in Cork, another source says that he succumbed to famine fever. So he may have been away for only 2 weeks, he may have been away for as much as several months, but all in all, it does seem as if he worked very hard, and his curate, Father Barrett, was there all the time, and both of them, it seemed, worked for it. Now, let's take a look at the map of the area for the building of this church. So there was no, Fisher had several converts already in this area of Toormore. He had built himself a house, the top left hand, you can see Toormore Cottage. He built himself a house so that he could come and minister to these people, but there was no church. If you look at the very bottom of the screen, you'll see the word Crumlech, and that's the altar wedge tomb that I showed you several slides back. You can see that there's a small village here with a schoolhouse, and that was the Protestant school that Fisher supported. Goleen was many miles away. It was over rough terrain, and he hit upon the notion that there should be a church here. Now, the school was supported by one of the Protestant societies, and Fisher provided what resources he could also. During the famine, he brought food to the school, and as not surprisingly, the enrollment greatly increased as a result. Bible reading was a large part of the curriculum, and clothing was distributed to the students as well. Fisher had a printing press, and he had a vast network of connections in the missionary and philanthropy field. So he set about energetically writing to everyone asking for funds. And at first he thought he might build a new school or another school, but then he hit upon the notion of a church. Here's an example of the kind of thing he was able to do with his printing press. In this case, this brochure was produced after the church was built. Now, this is the kind of church that was typical at the time. This is Timoleague Church of the Ascension. It's the kind of government-sanctioned establishment church that was being built all over Ireland at this time, funded by an organization called the Board of First Fruits. And there's a certain sameness to it, Gothic pointed arched windows and a square tower. Many of these small churches look almost identical. And this is what Fisher built, a very, very different church. Now, in the literature that I've found about this church, he refers to this church as a Celtic church and said it was modeled on the original old Irish churches. It was a nave and chancel church. So this is it looking from the back. So it had a nave, and then the chancel is a projection at the back which held the altar. And it had two transepts providing a cruciform shape. And note the very steeply pitched roof. And when you look at it from the side, you'll see these tall, narrow windows with triangular tops. And that triangle shape is carried out in the main door and also in the porch window. So where did this idea come from that this was a Celtic church? Well, here's an example. This is St. Flannan's Oratory in Killaloe, County Clare. And what you can see here is a steeply pitched roof, a western entry, the same as the Temple na Mucht had, a window over the main door. And this is one of the windows in that Romanesque, probably 12th century church in Killaloe. Interestingly, there was one other church that was identical in design to this one. It's the only one I can find. I can't find any other model for this anywhere. I don't know if Fisher came up with it. This is the church on Cape Clear, which was yet another attempt at a colony. This one established by the Reverend Spring. And this church is almost identical to Temple na Mucht, the Church of the Poor in Alter, and it in Tramore. Very interesting. I don't know who got the idea first, where the design came from, but these two churches very much relate. Sort of the symbolism of the church relates to Ussher's claim. And as I said, the Church of Ireland position that it was they, not the Catholics, that were the true Irish church. So the symbolic relation of this building, of the design of this building, is to the claim that this church was related to the original Church of Patrick. And interestingly, during the heyday of Catholic church building, which came much later, the neo-Romanesque style became very popular for the exact same reason. Now, inside the church was, as I said, a nave and chancel church, like Romanesque churches, but this also shows the Tractarian influence. This is no longer, the emphasis is no longer solely upon the pulpit. Previous churches didn't have chancels, and they had one, sometimes even two pulpits, and were often known as preaching boxes. And this is very interesting to this stepped triangle archway, which through on the windows and in the arch. Very interesting design, and I have no idea where Fisher got that, whether it was his own contrivance or based on something else. It certainly isn't Romanesque or early Irish in any way. Here's his pulpit and the vestry door, and it just shows that the same design was carried through in everything. But what I think is most remarkable about this church is that it was built at the absolute height of the famine, and completely by manual labor. Fisher, as most Victorians did, believed that charity didn't do any good, that wages worked better than charity, people should work. And in order to confine the wages to the most needy, he specified that no horses or carts could be used. And he thus excluded the better off farmers. There's no evidence that he employed only Protestants or converts. He appears to have employed both Catholics and Protestants. There's also no evidence that he stipulated any conditions such as Bible reading or conversion for those who built the church. Now, Owen Harris has written a play called Super Sullivan based on this story. He looked at all of this in detail. He conducted an enormous number of research with local people. He's convinced that these poorest of the poor, these landless laborers or spalpeens, were obviously very proud of what they'd built. And it's hardly surprising that they respected the minister who'd come to their aid and wanted to worship in what they saw as their church. Now, Fisher, however, got into hot water very quickly. So a Protestant church built by a Protestant minister using money raised for famine relief was always going to excite outrage. The crux of the matter, of course, is whether or not the aid he provided was conditional on conversion. There's no evidence that it was, but many other West Cork Protestant clergymen laboured to alleviate famine suffering, but most managed to remain on good terms with their Catholic neighbours, and they won praise from them rather than criticism. So let's look at some of the contemporary criticisms. Father Barrett, you remember he was Father Lawrence O'Sullivan's curate. This is what he had to say. Father Lawrence O'Sullivan, this is what he had to say. And finally, another contemporary quote by Michael O'Sullivan. Now, by this point in the famine, there was widespread panic among the Catholic hierarchy about the inroads that the evangelicals had been managing to make in the poorest parts of rural Ireland. The Achill colony had come in for particular harassment. This is the Bishop of Cork, John Murphy. He came from the wealthiest Catholic family in Cork. They were the owners and founders of Murphy's Distillery and later Murphy's Brewery. They were really merchant princes who traded across the world. He had been educated in Paris and Rome, and he was a considerable scholar. He sent for his nephew, John James Murphy, and Father John James Murphy, he tasked him with going to the Mizzen to sort out the state of affairs there. So here's John James Murphy. He's described as tall, dressed always head to toe in black, and riding a spectacular black charger. He was known, and I promise you I'm not making this up, as the Black Eagle of the North. Now, where on earth did he get that name? Well, he'd spent his younger days working as a fur trader for the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. And there was a long and complex story about how he'd been made a blood brother and been given the name the Black Eagle of the North. And of course, this all added to his mystique. So Father Murphy brought supplies with him, meal for the children in the national school. He took lodgings in Goleen, and he set about sniffing out the converts. He mounted the wall outside Champel na Bocht on a Sunday and proceeded to give fiery sermons, exhorting them to return to their true faith and insisting that they recant at Fisher's Gate. His appearance and his eloquence was electrifying, and it soon had the desired effect on some, but by no means all of the converts. So he did manage to win back some converts, but by no means all of them. The Diocese of Cork, the Catholic Diocese of Cork, now began to pay some serious attention to their far-flung parishes in the Mizzen. And the first the first to arrive, and this is, by the way, a picture of Vincent de Paul, St. Vincent de Paul. The first to arrive was a group of Vincentian priests, and they specialized in what were, when I was growing up, they were always called missions. They were week-long marathons of preaching and vigils and prayer, intended to bolster the faith or to put the fear of God into the congregation. And they were followed by organizers for the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, who set up chapters in all the towns. They were, and they still are, famously good at organizing charity and relief. So here was then the counter accusation. So the Protestant ministers, in a published statement, accused John Murphy and the Vincentians of failing to come during the horrors of famine and arriving only now in the harvest to propagate Romanism. So the question is, were the Catholics in their turn more motivated by the need to win back souls, by the need to nourish bodies? Now, there's no doubt that local priests gave their all to do what they could, and many worked in harmony with their Protestant counterparts. But this is a very telling accusation. The Murphys were an extremely wealthy family by the standards of the time, and yet Father Matthew had excoriated Bishop John's brother, the father of the Black Eagle, for exporting grain while people were starving. I suppose you wouldn't really, though, expect the apostle of temperance to be a fan of distillers. But by 1851, there was an enormous brand new church in Goleen, and that's an extraordinary effort so soon after the devastation of the famine. This church occupies a prominent place in the town, as so many triumphalist churches from this period do, and it's still a busy church, probably not as busy as time goes by and the Catholic Church continues to lose its tight grip on the Irish population, but it's certainly very busy compared to Fisher's Church. This is the other church in Goleen. It's Fisher's Church of Ireland Church, and for want of a congregation, it's been sold off and is now in use for making sales. This is Archbishop MacHale of Tuam. The Achill colony, like Fisher, had in the end saved most of the population of Achill. They fed everybody in the end, Catholic, Protestant, convert or no, and saved the vast majority of the people in Achill from starvation. And rather than being grateful, MacHale thundered from the pulpit, and I want to quote you his directive, because this is similar to what Father Murphy would have been exhorting in the Mizzen. Here's a direct quote from him. "Have nothing to do with these heretics. Curse them, hoot at them, spit them in their faces. Cut the sign of the cross in the air when you meet them, as you would against devils. Throw stones at them, pitch them when you have the opportunity into the bog holes. Nay, more than that, do injury to yourselves in order to injure them. Don't work for them, though they pay in ready money. Don't take any medicine from their heretic doctor. Rather die first." Well, I can't say that that shows much compassion. Cardinal Paul Cullen arrived shortly thereafter from Rome to take charge of the Irish Church, and this started a long reign in which the Catholic Church was totally transformed and brought into line with European mainstream Catholicism. It's the victors who write history, of course, and in this case, it's true that Fisher was on the wrong end of history. But I think you can see in MacHale's words just as virulent an anti-Protestantism as the evangelicals, including Fisher, spouted against Catholicism. And sadly, this spirit of sectarian strife was allowed to carry on well into the 20th century. And in fact, I'm not sure we've gotten rid of it yet. So the word superism has persisted in the Irish vocabulary. And as I said, it's one of the worst insults you could say to someone, and it's still potent after all these years. It connotes that you've sold your soul for some kind of material advantage, that you've betrayed your tribe for gross self-interest. So I'm interested to see if stories about Fisher persisted in local folklore. Now, Dúchas is, as many of you know, the National Folklore Archive, and within this is the schools collection. During 1937 to 39, more than 50,000 school children from 5,000 schools in the Irish Free State were enlisted to collect folklore in their home district. And I wanted to see if the collection's online, it's searchable. I wanted to see if stories about Fisher had persisted. And what I found, I would say, astonished me. the memory's still very much alive, but they kind of turned into folk tales, a bit garbled and confused. Fisher was accused of everything: withholding food unless people converted, commandeering all the clothing donations, evicting people who wouldn't convert, all kinds of things like that, none of which there's any actual evidence for. But here is an actual quote. Here's a typical entry. Now those last two sentences are very stark, aren't they? There's no compassion in here for those who were starving, is there? And not a trace of the sense that anybody would convert out of conviction or turn away from the Catholic Church unless they were forced to by extreme conditions. I grew up in that tradition. Here I am. This is me in this picture somewhere. I won't tell you which one I am, in St. Patrick's National School in Bray at the end of the 50s. And I'm very familiar with these kinds of stories. The John Barry story is all too familiar with me, to me. A man who'd let his children starve to death rather than take the soup. And even though he was supposedly being held up as a hero, I remember being horrified that even then, as a child, that any man would do that to his children. Although, of course, that wasn't the intent of the story, but that's what I heard. Here's another one of the schools represented in the Fisher stories, Glown School, now long deserted. And this is perhaps the story that affected me most. Now, what I want you to note in this is that the ethos of the classroom was that it was acceptable to name and shame living people as supers. And I think this piece, more than any other, is illustrative both of the long memory of these events and of the classroom ethos of devout Catholicism in which this child writes. An atmosphere in which it had been normalized to name and shame the supers and their descendants several generations on. Now, in my mind, to me, this is divisive sectarianism at its most abhorrent. And I think it's just as important to understand this when you read the school's collection as it is to chuckle about the funny story about the man who tried to walk on water. So my hope is that we've moved beyond this now in Ireland and that we can bring compassion and understanding of all the complex forces at work during this awful time, and that we can accept that many people change religion to genuine conviction rather than being bought by soup. I can't absolve Fisher of bigotry, even though it was the norm of his time, and his enthusiasm for his version of salvation made him fall out with his Catholic colleagues in desperate times. But despite that, and despite his legacy, we have to acknowledge that William Allen Fisher saved hundreds of people in the Mizzen from starvation through his own energy and his genuine love of the poor people under his care. He and those poor laborers should be celebrated, not condemned for their achievement in building this beautiful church. In a spirit of reconciliation, I would wish for the term super to fall into disuse as an insult in Ireland, and I would wish for Fisher to rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala. That was a fascinating lecture. I have a couple of questions coming through here on the Q&A. One is from someone you mentioned already. So Patricia Byrne has written a fantastic book on the colony in Achill. So she's got a question. Hi, Fionnuala. Most interesting talk. I've written a book on Edward Nangle and the Achill mission, the preacher and the prelate. I've read it myself. It's a really, really good read. Just wonder if you've seen St. Thomas's Church at Dugort that was built by Edward Nangle circa 1850. It seems very similar in design to Temple na Bocht. Patricia.
Oh, Patricia, that's wonderful. I'm going to get to Achill as soon as I can. I've been wanting to get there. As you know, we've all been wanting to get everywhere. I've been wanting to get there for a long time. And to really, I remember being in Achill as a child, but of course knew nothing of these things then, and have wanted to get back there now for a couple of years. So I'll be up there as soon as possible and take a really good look at that church, and be very interested to see whether or not it's got those same elements, because it's very curious, isn't it, this design, and where did it come from? The other thing is that it wasn't a sanctioned church. It was built by private funds, not by the Board of First Fruits. And afterwards, Fisher realized that he needed to put a vicar in there, a minister, and he also needed to ensure that it could be maintained. And so during the sale of lands, he bought a lot of the land around there in order to provide support for the minister of the church. And interestingly, that's one of the reasons why, because he was such a big landlord in the area, he was afterwards accused of threatening people with evictions in case they converted. That was one of the stories that came down. There doesn't appear to be any basis, in fact, but thank you very much. And I'm going to look out for, I'm going to buy that book because it sounds like right down my alley. Thank you, Patricia.
Yeah, we might actually invite Patricia on for a lecture if she's interested. Okay. It's a fascinating topic down in Achill, Edward Nangle and the Achill mission. A question here from Gerard Finola. Was there a concerted effort by managers of the workhouses who are mainly Protestants at Protestantization of Catholics?
Not that I know of, Gerard. There may have been here and there. I haven't read much about that. And I also didn't know that they, well, I suppose I did know that they would have been mainly Catholics, yes, because they would have been employees of the Poor Law Union, or mainly Protestant, I should say. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, but that sounds like a really interesting lead.
There's a question here, Finola, from a person I might know, John Knightley. The church Temple na Bocht seems to be in very good condition. Is it still used as a place of worship?
Yes, it is. It's and it has quite a thriving community. There still occasionally, when Owen Harris did his interviews, people told him that their church meant a lot to them, and that they were still being insulted frequently by their Catholic neighbors. One woman told a very moving story about being stoned and name called on her way to school. And however, it's a particularly interesting church for not just for the reason that of the story that I've told, but also because it has a very committed, small but very committed congregation. And one of the things they have done is let the churchyard, which is also a graveyard, let all kinds of wildflowers flourish. So it's a wonderful place to visit in the spring and summer. And they have very rare wildflowers. There are lots of orchids. I was tempted to throw in some of those pictures, Liam, but I'm already over time, including the bee orchid, which, as some of you may know, is a very rare, very beautiful flower. So it's a great place to visit. So if ever you're down in West Cork, do stop by and go to the Altar Wedge tomb, and then across the road to Temple na Bocht.
And thanks so much, Finola, for another fantastic lecture. I think we've got Robert back in a few weeks' time. So that was fantastic. That was really, really informative. And you answered all of the questions really during the lecture. So on Wednesday, we've got the 9 Years' War, 1959 to 1603 by James O'Neill. Thanks so much, Finola, for a fantastic lecture. It's brilliant to see the attendance so high again, given we've changed from the meetings format to the webinar format. Great to see that people have joined the new lecture. Finola, have a great evening, and thank you so much for joining us. And no doubt we'll have you back again soon. Thank you so much.
Everybody.
Thanks, Finola. That was brilliant.